4, Amos chapter 4. And if you do not have a lesson, go ahead and raise your hand. And who's got the lessons? Jason does. All right. So he'll pass them out as you're turning to Amos chapter 4. In case you don't know, that is in the Old Testament. Because you know how it is when you get into the minor prophets. Quite often you get into the minor prophets and you think, is that even in the Bible? But yes, it is. And yes, we're going to look here in the book of Amos tonight and see what God has for us. Amos chapter 4, verse number 12 is going to be our text verse. This is the theme verse here for the whole of the book of Amos. I'm trying to give him a little bit more time. You missed your brother up here. I know you did that on purpose.
Brother.
All right. Anybody else need one? Doesn't have one yet. All right. There you go. All right. If you found your place, Amos chapter 4, verse 12, let's stand together as we read our text. Amos chapter 4, verse number 12. Therefore, thus will I do unto thee, O Israel, and because I will do this unto thee, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. Father, we thank you for your word that you've given us to look at tonight, and we pray that as we study, that you would just open our hearts and our minds. Give us understanding to what your word is saying. And Lord, I pray that you give us a heart not just to understand, but to apply what your word is saying. Lord, that this might not be an exercise in mere education in your word, but Lord, that this would be a help to us spiritually in our walk with you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. Quite often, we ignore the prophets, and especially what we call the minor prophets. We call them the minor prophets. And of course, that's because they're shorter. But the Hebrews called them the 12. They didn't call them the minor prophets. We didn't get that from the Hebrews. They called them the 12 because they knew that a man is not measured by the length of his manuscript. When you get into the minor prophets, they may be shorter, but that doesn't make them less valuable, nor does it make them less true. And so that's an important thing as we study the minor prophets. And of course, we're almost halfway through the minor prophets now, but the thing is, as we study, we should not look at these books of the Bible as less important. And here's the thing that we need to think about. If the minor prophets were less important, why did God bother having them write it all? But he did. And he did for a reason. And it's for, Paul said, it's for our learning. He said it's for our example. And so we need to study even the minor prophets and see what God has for us there. So among the first of the 12 minor prophets, as we call them, but what the Jews called the 12 is Amos, chronologically speaking. So he's, as time goes, he was the first of these minor prophets. His ministry began some 40 years after Elisha. Now you think about that. And if you remember, as we were going through the Chronicles, we were going through 1st and 2nd Kings, and we studied and we saw some things about Elisha and about his ministry. Only 40 years passed between his ministry and now that of Amos, but some changes had occurred. And you see that as you do a study of the times of Elisha, and then as you study this, Assyria had now emerged as a superpower, as the new world power, as it were. They had a drive, they had an appetite for conquest. It wasn't, hey, we should, it's we must have conquest. We must fight, we must conquer, we must do this. And of course, their policy was to uproot the conquered peoples and move them far, far away from home to a place that's totally unfamiliar to them. But that's how they did. The kings of Judah and Israel had been strong, capable, and vigorous up to this point. And by the time that Amos comes along, a whole generation had grown up in an Israel that really had not known defeat. Now, you know what happens when a bully doesn't know what it is to be defeated? They think that, yeah, their head's bigger than their body. You understand what I'm saying? And you can't reason with them because they know everything, because they've never known defeat. That's one reason why, this is a little bit of rabbit here, but that's okay. It won't be the first one, and it probably won't be the last. But when the boys were young, we used to play games together. I did not let them win. Now, it's not necessarily that I struggled and fought to win, but I didn't necessarily go out of my way to lose. And you know why? Children need to learn how to lose. We all know children that have not learned how to lose. And when all of a sudden they lose, they throw a fit. They kick and scream, they cry and fret until, oh, I'm sorry, I'll let you win. I'm not a fan of that sort of parenting. And obviously, I just said that, didn't I? Because, my boys do, and they have beat me at different games that we've played, but they've done it honestly, by their own effort, and not just because they're little, and just because they're cute. And when they were little, they were cute. What happened to them since then, I don't know. But the thing is, Israel now, they've gone a whole generation, they have not known defeat. So what were they? Big-headed people, entitled people who thought that the world revolved around them. That's what they were. And what's more than that, they had pushed north to Damascus, and the nation of Judah was in the same condition. They pushed south as well, and really, what they controlled together was very similar to what was under Israel's control during Solomon's time. So it's an amazing situation that they're in. Politically speaking, these were good times. Spiritually speaking, these were horrible times. And so, again, I mentioned this last week and the week before when we were looking at the book of Joel. We have to be careful about equating politics with spirituality and thinking that just because politics are, the winds of politics are blowing our way, that God must be for us. And, we're really in a victory mode. We shouldn't do that because it's unwise. It's unwise because quite often the two do not join hands at all. Politics and really having a right relationship with God. But anyway, let's go on. Israel had undergone a cultural change because up until this point they were a nation of fighting farmers, but now with this new feeling of national security and power, the idea that nobody can beat us and we're unstoppable and we can do whatever we want. And so it caused them to become more urbanized, sophisticated, worldly-wise, cultured, and of course, proud, because that goes with that. In the cities, people were preoccupied with getting rich, and the tenants of the royal courts were busily building great mansions for themselves from the money that was extorted from the poor. Into this scene comes Amos. So again, politically speaking, everything's beautiful. But spiritually speaking, it's not a good situation. So this is one of those times where people aren't interested in what the preacher has to say. Because when materially people are doing well, and when politically things seem to be doing well, nobody wants to hear what God has to say. They're satisfied. Everything's good. Everything's just like I want it to be. And, don't upset the apple cart by telling me that my heart's not right with God. And that's really kind of what Amos does. Amos was a herdsman from down south. He wasn't from Israel. He was from Judah. So he was a cousin, as you would say, but he wasn't a local. Did he have any business up there? Sure he did, because God sent him there. But nonetheless, I'm sure that there were many people there in Israel who said, go home. Go home. Sort of like, I'll never forget one time, we had been preaching in the market. I was a teenager at the time, and I wasn't preaching, my dad wasn't preaching, but there was one of the young men in our church was preaching. He had preached a great salvation message. And the local priest from the local so-called Christian religion came down. He was so upset that we were preaching the gospel there. And anyway, just to make a long story short, the last thing he said to my dad and I as we got ready to leave is, go home, white man. Go home, white man. Which, white man to them was a racial slur. And, so what? My skin's white. What am I going to do about it? You think you're going to get me upset about that? It is what it is. And I can't change that. And so that's what he said. And I'm sure in Amos' time, yes, they were related. But hey, look, you're not even from here. You've got no business saying anything about what goes on here. You just need to go back to your own country and take care of your own business instead of messing with us. I'm sure that's part of what was going on, and we'll see some things about it. But he was from Tekoa. That was his home, which is about 6 miles south of Bethlehem, about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. And he left his hometown of nation and ended up in Bethel. And here he sees scenes that brings his blood to a boil. He saw people worshiping a golden calf, yet calling the calf by the name of Jehovah. And if you study the Chronicles and study the Kings, that's what you find what happened. When Jeroboam made the golden calves, he never said, these are new gods. He said, these are the gods that brought us out of Egypt. He was harking back to Jehovah. And so he never pretended like he was creating some new religion. He pretended like we're still serving God. We're still serving the Lord here. That's how he acted. And that's how they did. They thought they were still serving the Lord. That is what made it so hateful to God. And you find each one of the kings, while they all had their problems, the one thing that God said about every one of them that angered him to the point that he took them out of the land is the fact that they never left those golden calves. They would talk about, oh, hey, I'm going to serve the Lord, but then they'd go right back to the golden calf and then talk about serving the Lord in front of the golden calf. Don't you think God would be upset about that? And I know he is, and I know he was when that went on. But anyway, there are also cults that worship nature, and those things were flourishing in the time that Amos was there. But there was a bluntness that Amos had in his speech that had to cause a shudder to run up and down the spine of the sophisticated people, the professional priests, and the prophets of Bethel. Can you imagine somebody actually coming in and telling it like it is? That's not our culture. Our culture is to dance around things and pretend like everything's okay, even when it's not. Even when we say something's not right, we won't say what it is that's not right. Isn't that true? Somebody has a problem. Hey, what's wrong? Oh, nothing. And you can tell they're miserable and they want you to be miserable too. What's wrong? Nothing. But, these people, they had to be upset with Amos Because he didn't come in and play nice. He came in and told the truth. And I'll be honest with you, that's what we need today. We don't need somebody to come in and play nice with us and tell us what wonderful people we are. Our culture does that every day. Oh, you're wonderful. You get a participation trophy because you breathe. Really? But to have somebody come in and say, look, this is reality. And I'm thinking about some things that are going on in our country right now. If you stand up and say, this is reality, all up and down the line, everybody would have a stroke to actually be honest and say, this is what's right. And everything that you're saying, even though the whole country is spouting the same story, is wrong. But anyway, let's go on. In chapter 1 and verse number 1, we see the introduction of the prophet. And here it says, the words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Now, Amos introduces himself to the people of Israel without degree or pedigree. He doesn't say, hey, look who I am. He's just from among the herdmen. He's got nothing to brag about. Look, the priests and the prophets, they were professionals that were put in place in Jeroboam's day. They have the occupation of pastor. The vocation, if you want to use that term. That's what they have. They're professionals in what they're doing. He had no claim to lineage as a prophet or a priest. He had no special training. I'm just a herdman. And so you know that these prophets and the priests there in the nation of Israel, they had to look at him and say, don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't been to seminary. Turn over, if you will, to 2 Timothy chapter 2. What Amos was God's man in God's place at God's time, sharing God's message. That's what he was. He was a vessel ready to be used. That's what he was. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 20. As we get here, 2 Timothy 2:20. But in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and of earth, and some to honor, and some to dishonor. If a man therefore purge himself from these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified, and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. So what he did is he made himself clean before God. In other words, he lived a sanctified life. He didn't just go on with the flow because everybody else is doing it, therefore it must be all right. He didn't do that. He said, no, this is what would be pleasing to God. Therefore, this is what I will do regardless of what everyone else does. He lived a sanctified life, and he made himself available to God. He didn't come up with all the excuses. How many times do we give excuses to God? God puts something on our heart and we say, well, I'm too young. That's usually my problem. I'm too young. Or I'm too poor. Or I'm too rich. I don't know that any of us have that problem tonight. But anyway, I have too many responsibilities, or I don't have enough responsibilities. God, I would do that, but... And we have all the excuses why we can't be available to God. God's looking for somebody who's available today. God's still looking for people who are available. People who are willing to be used. Not people who have the pedigree or the degree. That's not what God's looking for. God's looking for people who are available and willing to be used of God no matter where and no matter what. That, to be honest, ought to be our goal today as believers. To be ready and available to God no matter where, no matter what. And then when God gives us an opportunity to serve Him, we don't come back with, well, I would, but, there's this and there's that. We come up with all the excuses. And then we sit back and say, yeah, it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything for God. Well, that's because we're not. It's because we're giving God excuses instead of service. We need to be like Amos. We need to learn from his example. Let's go back here to Amos chapter 1. We see the vigilance of the prophet. Now it's interesting what he does here. Because what Amos does, and of course it's because the Lord led him this way. He didn't come up with a plan. Hey, you know what? I want more people to come to my church, so you know what I'm going to do? I've got this plan, and I've got this program, and I'm going to put that into play. He didn't do that. What he did was he gave God's message. But it's interesting how God did that. Because what he does is he begins talking about the lands near to God's people, and he gained the ear of the people of Israel because God led him to speak judgment against Syria, the Philistines, Tyre, Ammon, Edom, Moab, and even Judah. So when he's doing that, that perked their ears up. Oh, hey, we like this guy. Yeah. We like what he's got to say. This is wonderful. Now, he did not do that on his own. And I've said this before. No God-called man comes up with his own message. Nod your heads up and down because it's true. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that they get something in email? Now, I've heard of that. I've seen it. I've seen where you can sign up to get all these, outlines in your email so you never have to study and that sort of thing. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying that the message that the man of God preaches isn't what he decided to preach on his own. He preaches what God lays on his heart. And he studies what God lays on his heart. And that's the message he brings. And that's what's going on here with Amos. It's not that Amos sat down all devious and conniving. Oh, if I do this, and if I do it this way, then more people will pay attention. That's not what's going on. He's doing exactly what God told him to do. But God did it in such a way that it caught people's attention. Well, hey, let's go see what he says, because he's been talking bad about all these people that are causing us problems. So he must be pretty good. And so he begins talking about those always considered as Gentile foreigners by Israel in chapter 1, verses 2 through 10. Let's look at verse 3 through 5. Here he talks about Damascus. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. But I will send a fire into the house of Hazael, which shall devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad. So, he starts out for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4. And that's not a mathematical equation. Oh, yeah, 4 sins. Now, that's enough. It's not the way God works. It is really a poetic way of saying the measure's full. Time's up. I've given you time to repent. I've given you time to make things right with God. Your time is up. And that's what's going on here. And he, again, as we read in verse 3, says, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. So God didn't leave them doubting. Why is it that God's going to send judgment against us? He didn't leave them doubting. He laid it right out there. They threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. These threshing instruments were curved slabs studded with sharp basalt teeth, which were drawn over the heaped corn by horses and used not only to thresh the wheat, but to crop the straw into little pieces. And that's the way the Syrians had been treating Israel. That's pretty bad. And that's why God was going to send judgment to them. In verses 6 through 8, you see the judgment of Gaza. Let's read that, verse 6. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they carried away captive the whole captivity, to deliver them to Edom. But I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof, and I will cut off the inhabitant from Ashdod, and him that holdeth the scepter from Ashkelon. And I will turn mine hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, saith the Lord God. So the Philistines had gone beyond the customary practice of when there's a war and you take prisoners captive, you sell them and you make money that way. So they've gone beyond that to actually simply going on raids to capture people that they can sell into slavery so that they can make money. And the bad thing is they're selling to the Edomites, who are, again, the cousins of the Israelites. But anyway, that's what they were doing. 4 of the 5 Philistine cities were denounced by Amos because Gath, the one city that's not mentioned, had already been destroyed by this time. In verses 9 and 10, he talks about Tyre. Let's look at that. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity to Edom, and remembered not the brotherly covenant. But I will send a fire on the wall of Tyrus, which shall devour the palaces thereof. Tyre had treaties with Israel that dated all the way back to the reign of Solomon. But they betrayed those treaties. They turned their back on that and had handed the Israelites over to Edom. And of course, Edom, they're not going to treat them well, as we'll see here in just a minute. But God didn't take lightly that kind of betrayal of his people. One thing that we see about this is exactly what God said. God said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Now, what we often say is, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. That's what we do. We kind of twist it around to make it, well, they did it to me first. We act like little kids, because that's what little kids do. Now, when we get older, we're supposed to get past that, but quite often we don't. We were kind of talking before church tonight about maturity. When you get older, you mature. For some people, that doesn't happen. And, the numbers get bigger, but the maturity level doesn't change. And when it comes to this aspect, it's true. Somebody does something to us, well, I had to stand up for myself. And we excuse away all sorts of things that aren't right. And if somebody else did it, we would tell them it wasn't right. But it's okay for us, because we have all the excuses, we have all the reasons. But what we find here is Tyre betrayed Israel. But God's the one that took care of it. That ought to teach us something. And that ought to teach us that when people do us wrong, we don't need to talk to anybody about it. Nobody. I've had people do me wrong. Well, I know that's hard to believe. Anybody would ever want to do me wrong. It has happened. I did tell you I had a sister, right? She made it her life's plan. Anyway, we have people do us wrong. And the first thing that we want to do is tell everybody else how wrongly we've been treated. Do you realize what we're doing? We are taking the situation into our own hands. Instead of leaving it in God's hand for God to deal with. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Not me. It's not for me to run down everybody else that's done me wrong. That's not my job. It's my job to be faithful to God. God will take care of those who have done me wrong. I don't have to deal with it. Just like here. Israel didn't have to deal with it. God took care of it. We need to do what? We need to trust God. We need to be faithful to God no matter who hurts us. I know a lot of people who are not in church today because they've been hurt in church. Well, somebody in church, a deacon in the church did me wrong, the pastor did me wrong, or some individual in the church did me wrong, so I'm never going to go back to church. And those people think that they're hurting those church people by doing that. And that's not what's happening. They're hurting themselves. And it's a sad, sad situation when that happens. Let's go on and look at verses 11 and 12. So not only does Amos talk about those always considered as Gentiles, foreigners, but also those always considered as genetic family. In other words, they're related. And you find that in chapter 1, verse 11 through chapter 2, verse 3. But he talks about Edom here, verses 11 and 12. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Baza. That doesn't sound like good times to me. But Edom was supposed to be treated like a brother. Look back over in Deuteronomy 23. That's what God said to Israel. You, Edom, that's your brother. I've given them their land. You're not going to get any of it. So when you come through on your way to the promised land, don't bother them. You leave them alone. Now that's not how Edom responded to that, but that's what God told them to do. Deuteronomy 23, in verse number 7. Thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, for he is thy brother. Thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian, because thou wast a stranger in his land. So Edom was supposed to be treated like a brother, but that was not reciprocated. Edom never reciprocated that feeling. Instead, they hated the Jews. When we get over to the book of Obadiah, we'll see some more of that. But they hated the Jews. They hated Israel, and any time that they could do anything to hurt the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah, whichever, they were glad to do that. They were excited for the opportunity. And so God was going to bring judgment there. The nation of Ammon, back here in Amos chapter 1 and verse 13. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of the children of Ammon, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have ripped up the women of the children of Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. But I will kindle a fire in the wall of Rabbah, and it shall devour the palaces thereof, with shouting in the day of battle, with a tempest in the day of the whirlwind, and their king shall go into captivity, he and his princes together, saith the Lord. The nation of Ammon was at war constantly with Israel, but it was a war of extermination so that they could take the land that was owned by the Jews. And the Ammonites had a cruel religion, one that gloried in placing little children in the red-hot lap of Molech to be dropped living in the raging furnace in the idol's belly. That was their religion. And that's how they worshiped. But here's the reality. Savage belief produces savage behavior. And that's how they treated Israel. They treated them savagely. And what a horrible thing that was. But the thing is, God will avenge both savage belief and savage behavior. Over in the book of Jude, verses 14 and 15. Jude, verses 14 and 15. And Enoch also, the 7th from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches, which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So here, God is going to avenge that. They may be savage in their belief and their behavior, but God's going to take care of that. Back here again in the book of Amos, chapter 2, in these first 3 verses, Amos deals with the nation of Moab. He says, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. But I will send a fire upon Moab, and it shall devour the palaces of Kerioth. And Moab shall die with tumult, with shouting, and with the sound of the trumpet. And I will cut off the judge from the midst thereof, and will slay all the princes thereof with him, saith the Lord. What a horrible thing. Moab wasn't brought into judgment for their mistreatment of Israel. Isn't that interesting? That we know from reading the history that God gives us in His Word that Moab did mistreat Israel. But that's not why they were going to be judged. You know what we find here? God doesn't play favorites. That's what you find. He's going to judge sin no matter who it's committed against. Sometimes we like to pretend, don't we? Well, I did wrong, but it was against them. And therefore it must be okay. We do that. We try to justify our sin sometimes that way. But that's not, definitely not pleasing to the Lord. And it ought not be our attitude. Again, our attitude ought to be more like Amos. That we want to be sanctified before the Lord, and that we want to be available for His service, rather than seeking our own revenge, rather than worrying about excusing what we've done to other people. We simply need to be with God, in our relationship with God, like Amos was. We're going to go ahead and stop here. So let's stand together with our heads bowed and our eyes closed.